from my part here in the room, and also the spectators actually at home. So reducing, compensating, investing, sustainability in foundry industry, that's going to be our topic today. This morning we'd already visited other Vögel, and I think a bit redundance will be there for the ones present here, because the ones digitally joining us, of course, have not heard so much of these topics. Now let us first welcome the other participants, Dr. Ioannidis, so President Semaphone and Managing Director of Skafrecht GmbH for Machinery for use, Föhl, Uri Schwab, Technical Managing Director of Föhl. And then we also have you, Dr. Christian Reisinger, Specialist for Climate Protection with CO2 Balancing, and the Managing Director of Climate GmbH in Munich. Thank you very much, Ms. Verius, for the introduction. I work in House of Gießerei. I'm responsible for PR work and the chief editor of the Foundry, so that's the industry title you may know. So thanks a lot to the trade fair. And the question, whether I want to contribute to this day, so of course I was willing to, because sustainability is a topic which does not at all surprise me. I think this is the topic which is on everybody's lips, and we've actually worked this out. And I can tell you one thing, as BDG this year, we actually had a focus event about the Future Day we held at the end of June. Of course, it was very much about the environment, the big everything, you see. That's what we're going to discuss, everything. Where are we going to, what about the energy pricing, where will the future electricity come from, and so on. Well, and just a joke, to tell you in the beginning, last week I was actually at Iron Melting Conference in Saarbrücken, where, among others, someone from Linde gave a presentation telling us that ThyssenKrupp, for the use in the furnace in between actually demand for 50 to 70,000 hydrogen, and they said 50 to 70 that could be provided, but the demand was 70, and so they could just provide 500. So you could say that it's really very special. That's not so relevant for the die casting industry, but it shows the problems. But before starting with the three of you, I would like to point out that, of course, with COT, we will talk about reduction, but the sustainability, and that's what I understand from the trade fair. That's more than that. We classically, of course, in sustainability, we have the ecological and the economic and the social aspects. We're sitting with two SMEs, Frey since 49, Mr. Schwab since 59. You've actually been producing for Föhl in how many generations? You also represent the SMEs, that accounts actually for its social responsibility. That's the social aspect we have. I just want to mention this. We don't want to go deep into details, because we want to talk more about CO2. We have the economic aspects, and I can only tell you, advertising for the industry with the process die, we have actually a possibility that all the metals can actually be used in a circle, all the other materials can't. And I think we have very good conditions in the foundry industry, and we have actually made a good contribution to sustainability. And let us, however, focus. And I'll look at you, Dr. Reisinger. Let's focus on the ecological process. Let's have a look at the process heat and the energy consumption in general, where in the operation is CO2 released, and what about this carbon footprint? And just tell us, talk about us, about scopes and balancing. The terms with scopes and greenhouse gas protocol, there's the international standard for CO2 balancing. Where all these terms come from? For a lot of people for outsiders, that sounds like a mystery. However, it's not that complicated. Once you've done it 2 or 3 times, you can just have to allocate the emission closest to various categories. We have the Scope 1 emissions, which are simply emissions which you as a company actually generate yourselves. To simplify this, what comes actually out out of your actually chimney or from your vehicle park. These are the emissions you produce. Then there's some special topics such as fugitive emissions from coal or the ones generated by chemical processes. But actually, basically, it's the energy and the process ones. The scope 2 and emissions are the ones of the externally bought energy. You don't generate yourself, but you buy it from an energy supplier. It could also be a power station, which actually is actually another possibility. These are the emissions, for instance, from long-distance heating. You don't actually generate the energy yourself, but you buy it. So that's the non-green part of electricity, for instance. In most companies, scope 2 actually that has the electricity. If you use ecological electricity, depending on the balancing, but according to the general balancing approach, if you use ecological electricity, you have a zero, but you may have emissions in scope 3 because for building, for instance, a wind wheel or solar plants, there may be emissions rising, but only scope 1 and scope 2 are obliging or mandatory. That means you can actually make a CO2 balance as a company only looking at the direct emissions and the direct in the energy consumption, but it's roughly incomplete because in most manufacturing companies, a huge part, if not the majority of the emissions is in scope 3, which is a catch-all category where everything comes together, which is not scope 1 or scope 2, which simply means other indirect CO2 emissions. You may have various topics such as the business travels, so the travel of your employees to the place of work. You have all the materials you buy, the incoming logistics, the outgoing logistics. So all these are topics which actually are very intensive in emissions with producing companies, and the raw materials we buy play the biggest role. This is why there's a trend which appears if worldwide all companies prepared a CO2 balance and all of them balance scope 1 and scope 2, all the international emissions would be taken, but we wouldn't have any scope 3. But presently, our situation is that, especially when you think in terms of products, you say you really want to know about the CO2 emission of a ready product, the raw material needs to be integrated, although you don't make them yourselves, down to the mine where the ores come from. That's quite common to make the CO2 balance according to scope 1 to 3. Now I wonder, Mr. Schwab, I would like to look at you. We have a rough overview of the scopes. Early in 2020, as a climate neutral, you actually defined yourself as a climate neutral foundry. How do you define that? We are scope 1 and scope 2, climate neutral, not according to scope 3, because the raw material which we buy actually takes some energy when produced and also causes certain emissions, which we can't tackle with because they are generated where zinc or zinc alloy is made. But scope 1 and 2 are climate neutral, with the exception of a small share of our vehicle park, vehicle fleet, which we are changing step by step to electromobility. This is what we showed this morning. Scope 1 and 2 is valid. In our company, it's climate neutral. As you said, Dr. Reisinger, scope 3 is just scope 1 and 2 of the others. That's it. I mean, it depends on the target you want to reach. On all this topic, there's no wrong or right, because we always ask our customers, what's your target? If the target is want to be a climate neutral company according to scope 1 and 2, that's the target you pursued, I think. So that's the common approach. However, the target is rather made for consumer goods producers. If they say in DM or Edeka, I want to have a climate neutral product in the shelves, then of course the raw materials have to be taken into account. It's not sufficient to say this product only has its own share. The first step is also always to define the target, and then we can actually define the balancing limits. At this point, we should actually talk about customer expectations, and maybe, Mr. Schwab, what was your motivation to go into this direction with your company? I mean, we have a very for decades, we've actually engaged in environmental protection, energy efficiency, energy saving. This has always been a matter of close to our hearts, of our owner company, of the managing shareholders. When he joined the company, that was the first project he had. So occupational safety, environment, energy, quality. And so we simply see ourselves in a kind of social responsibility as a company towards the present and future generations to operate our business, to run our business, to ensure that in the long term it can be operated and run in a sustainable way under financial aspects, but also under the ecological aspects. And of course, we do not wish to deprive our planet and ourselves of the basis for living. That means an intrinsic motivation, an external one, which it's an intrinsic motivation, I'd say. We think it is better to act rather than being compelled to react. What's your experience with the tools, Scope 1 and Scope 2, in your specific balancing? What is the experience you had? How did it work in your company? Well, it worked quite well, quite easy. The decision that we want to become CO2 neutral in Scope 1 and Scope 2. Of course, we also want to be CO2 neutral in Scope 3, but it's not all that easy because it's not in our hands only. In Scope 1 and 2, it worked quite quickly. From the decision up to the implementation, of course, in Scope 1, it basically is about natural gas, which actually we burn at our melting pots. We compensate it by certificates, which actually, according to gold standard, are certified. We actually had everything checked to ensure everything was okay in Scope 2 spot at additional costs. So we actually buy ecological current electricity from Switzerland. So let me come back. Do you have experience from the customers? You may also have communicated that you are a climate neutral foundry. If I'm not mistaken, 2 years ago at the trade fair, the EUROGUSS, what happened? What has happened since then? What's the customer's feedback? The customer's feedback is actually a bit careful. I'm just having a look at our sales manager. So I would say it's still a bit it's a bit difficult. It will come, but careful. I'm sure that tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 suppliers will be required. So we will be actually ready. We also offer technologies, you could see, which are clearly the CO2 reduced in their emission. Our own coating for land, for instance, accounts for 1/6 of the CO2 emission as against a galvanic coating, but it is very difficult, especially with the in the automotive industry, in the ongoing serial production, to actually change a process or to change a material, raw material, because this will meet with lots of reservations. Also, you actually come up with price and cost advantages and advantages for the environment. I mean, here I think we have to work on that and insist on that, and simply we don't have to give up. And what about the customer contact and the customer relationship? What is the pressure that you may be exposed to? I think we should talk about that because it's relevant to have an overall general overview. Mr. Ioannidis, maybe you can talk about the initiatives at Oscar Frech, also with CO2 in particular. I would say that as a plant engineer, builders, we actually have to take into account the entire supply value-added chain. If we can actually perform the service with little material on it, but make sure that the machine will actually keep its promise, the machine, but take out whatever is possible with modern calculation methods, or even the process itself will manage to reduce temperatures where we actually melt metal, or if we advance digitization to reach a point that this engine which is running is not required, so I can switch it off if it works. I mean, all this is possible from in my view, and lots of companies do that, not only Frech. And I think in this field, the machine builders are on a good track, on a good way to offer possibilities, and also in their own company, as in our case, where since 2010 we have invested a lot. I think with smart foundry solutions, we actually built up a new huge department to offer possibilities and services to our customers for this electricity and all the other elements required. So how can we control them with regards to digitalization and control mechanisms to reduce the demand for resources? We called it resource efficiency program. So this actually has developed out of it, but also internally. We started on a very simple level 15 years ago when we said, my dear colleagues in the company, please in summer just switch the lever in the bathroom to the right. It doesn't have to be in the middle. So we just switch off the radiator, the heatings. You can do a lot. And so this helps you develop the spirit and the mindset in the company. We have to pay attention to when to open the windows, when do we really need an air conditioning system. Or for instance, the biggest energy saving could be reached just by actually having a virtual servers. The IT really uses a lot of energy in each company. It is incredible. You can really save them up. We also invested into a power station and also in Weiler into a combined heating power plant. We want to be CO2 neutral in the next few years, and out of the experience we got, we want to assist our customers. If I got that correctly, it's a key element to further develop the machine elements. It's the high efficiency. That means the reduced consumption of materials, especially in terms of electricity. Is that your intrinsic motivation, or is there a clear requirement? Or how shall I imagine it? How Mr. Schwab comes to you and says, or the machine says, but it should actually consume less electricity, otherwise we want ordered. You know, the foundry in Germany, in Europe, and all foundries have a hard time. It's not an easy time they're going through. They need to actually work as winners in a very difficult environment. They have to invest at the same time, come from the financial crisis, through the machine building, automotive crisis, up into the pandemic, and lost lots of capital, but need to invest nevertheless. So if we, as suppliers, if we say that there's something coming up, we need to pay attention to making sure that the customers we have, I don't want to say that we spot them to be competitive, but then it's too late. We can't start right now. We actually did that. We said that 7, 8, 9 years ago. So there's something coming up. We have to do something about that as an SME. It's our easy time. So the shareholders are at the table. We say, okay, let's all do that. So they had the courage. They invested. And that's simply the task of a supplier. We would say that it's a clear requirement of the customer. The new machine I order has a neutral, let's say, objectively seen, offers an advantage. But I would say that 6 or 7 years ago, with Measures Frech at our machines, we actually measured the energy at our machines to check where some kilowatts hours could be saved. We are not talking about huge leaps, but we're talking about we wanted to go step by step and save something here and save something there. All that requires a lot of work and time and work consuming. But on this kind of bilateral cooperation in which we are really honest with one another, we can really benefit from that, because we need to reach that in small little steps. So we could hear a bit about the tools, Scope 1 and 2, also from your companies. What do you do? What is your motivation? So in the end, I will have a CO2 footprint if I don't get everything to zero. Now we talk about compensation. What can I do with this CO2 footprint? What are my options? So basically, you're perfectly right. In most companies, the potential at short notice to save emissions is really very limited. That means we always distinguish between short-term unavoidable emissions and long-term unavoidable emissions, because you can see that this also involves investments and plant engineering, which can't be done within overnight. So in most industries, in fact, the potential at short notice to reduce something is really limited, and I can only do that. The only thing which is left is compensation. If I want to be climate neutral, I have to support a project which my emissions, which can't actually avoid emissions, can save emissions elsewhere, because globally these gases are actually distributed very homogeneously in the atmosphere. So with the project, it can actually be compensated with a project abroad. We can't say that the balance is no. So what we actually emit as in kinds of terms of greenhouse gases, or with an energy efficiency project, or with another project just to reforest the tree, the stations. How much to have to provide support in typical emission in order to compensate the typical emission of an SME? Can we have an exemplary calculation also with regards to financial aspects? I would say that this market is undergoing a radical change, because it's not just your industry that is dealing with it very much, but all industries do, and especially also since 2018, since a young Swedish student actually sat down in front of the parliament saying, I'm not going to school. Since then, so we can see an upwing. I've been actually in this topic. I've been involved in this topic for 10 years now, and this topic has never been so interesting among the people as never before. So very few, everything is actually based on very few climate certificates, but the price is rising. What the price will be exactly, we have to distinguish. We have the voluntary market, which must not be taken for the EU trade system. That's a different tool with a clearly fixed price, but here we can say that there are strong fluctuations between the individual projects. But just to give you an idea, in Germany, for January, we have had a CO2 tax on fossil fuels, and most climate protection projects are clearly below this price. That means it very much depends on the quantity. Do you actually compensate 100,000 or 100 tons, which makes a difference with regards to the transaction costs? But I do think that you can. Once you actually calculate with 10 euros, you may be quite okay. So presently, maybe certificates which are below that price, was relating to 1 ton of CO2, also a lot which are above, depending on the standard and the quantity, but that's just a kind of first calculation basis. 10 euros might be more or less okay. But I assume that the tendency is rising a lot. We now have 25 tons of CO2 tax, which has been politically fixed to 50 tons per 50 euros per ton. In Sweden has had a CO2 ton tax of 100 euros. So with 10 euros, we're still on a very low level. And I think this is going to rise in the medium term. Now, would you just explain us 10 euros, 20 euros for the certificates? What is the information that gives me? How many trees can I plant? What is the effect of it? Well, you can assume that the projects which specialize in this mechanism with 10 euros, you can actually engage more in climate protection as we do it yourselves. We're keeping us, can't we plant some trees ourselves? Or we have a bit of what can I actually compensate it with that? And I say, no, well, you can't, because we talk about additional emissions which have to be saved. I always explain it like this. As a housing company asked me, they wanted to become climate neutral, and they had 3,000 trees, and they misunderstand that because these trees have been standing for 100 years, not just simply because of the fact that they are theirs, they are not climate neutral. You have to do something in addition, which can be revealed in the projects. And so for each and every project, that's an individual calculation to see the price of the ton. But you always have the clear counter evidence, because you buy a service, and the best service is that someone actually closes this CO2 emission, which may vary in price, but it's like an evidence that this kind of service is really rendered. This always takes place retroactively. If I come up to you and say, I would like to realize a climate protection project, please give me some money, and I think after 2 years and I say, well, I just leave with this money. That's not what climate protection wanted me to reach. Just to exclude that these projects are pre-financed with the expectation that these income will be generated, so the trees have to grow for 1 year, and only once this has been certain by TÜV, SGS, PPC, or similar or the like. So the certificates will come to the market, can be bought by you, and this actually will finance the project retroactively. It's quite a solid mechanism behind that, and clearly stands out against the normal kind of donation, where very often I don't know what happens to the money. Now, talk about the word complex. In any case, can we already assess the compensation performance for the worldwide forests existing? Are we talking about per thousand, per percentage? Where is it? Where can we see the effects? I mean, I can't actually give you any specific figures. So reforestation is just one mechanism among many. Those are projects dealing with forest protection. But there are lots of projects dealing with renewable energies in regions where otherwise they would not be actually supported. For instance, a wind park in Africa or a water power plant in Africa, which would otherwise not have been built, as a consequence of which a coal power plant would not have to be built. There's a great variety in what we presently see in the situation. There's a huge demand for certificates, but just very few supplies, so that means the growth will be very high. It means for lots of project developers, it's attractive to say, we go into the market to develop new topics, also reforestation and so on. That means there will be an extreme tendency, an upwards trend, and the effect, the quantitative effect of these projects will be feelable. Mr. Schwab, what about you? First of all, we actually pay money for this, quite obviously. So in the 5-digit area, and as a thank you, we actually had 14,000 euros CO2 taxes. That's nobody actually can be explained what the meaning is. What do you say if you're CO2 neutral in scope 1 and 2, and then just to punish you, you have to pay CO2 for CO2. Nevertheless, I can perfectly understand the frustration. There are two regimes which are not interlinked. One of them is actually a tax system with a target of providing incentive back away from fossil energy carriers, and the other one is to promote projects elsewhere. But you can assume that what I actually do with CO2 tax is already climate neutral. If the money doesn't go to external project, it goes to the state money, which has been politically defined. That it's actually, this is supposed to define to reduce the EU monies. But you haven't actually heard, but you may not have realized that. But this is a topic which we will have to address before long, because it is a no-go that companies are left alone. You don't get any kind of support because you are climate neutral. You can't actually compensate it elsewhere or offset it elsewhere. There's a situation that has to change, and governments have to provide some results for that, and you shouldn't be left alone with this huge transformation. So my question is, so it's not just money that we pay, we also have new technologies that we develop. We actually develop new foundry technology, which is really a quantum leap, which helps us reduce by 50% the energy and also the CO2 consumption. Roughly 50% of energy can be saved. We have the fill-on technology we already talked about, with which CO2 emission is against the galvanic method. According to the figures we know, the galvanic experts don't actually reveal a lot of information, but according to the figures we know, the CO2 emission per component will only be 1/6. So not only actually do we open our money purse, but we really want to create new ideas with new technologies that have to be financed as well, because they don't fall from heaven, you see. They do cost some money, and so we are trying to use these technologies and developments and sell them to the customers. And the fact that we really want to earn money with that is not bad, is it? What do you do? What is your present situation? We invest and compensate. It's not, no, we don't have to compensate. But as Mr. Schwab said, that's exactly the point. The foundries, they have to do a lot. They have to invest a lot of money. But hopefully, they should get a bit more for what they do, and the market's not mature. So that means for the performance. So there is an industry that needs to do a lot, needs to invest from rather a weak position. That's something you shouldn't forget. The industry is not a strong position, that it had actually earned an awful lot of money and not burned or lost money during the crisis, but still they do have to invest a lot. But the entire chain, the customers, they are not willing to pay something for that. Maybe this kind of mindset will come about, but for the time being, it's going to be very difficult. And so you need a lot of support from the people who would actually take a look at that, saying that if we want to get this situation, if we want to preserve the situation in Germany and in Europe, I need to do something about that. Then we need to think about what can be done without actually falling to the subsidies. But what is really being done by the German foundries, that's really tremendous. And the competitors are not that rosy. I mean, fighting worldwide against other competitors, wherever they are, in Eastern Europe and Asia, wherever, under different situations, going through crisis and investing nevertheless with customers who wish to earn money themselves and are not willing to pay everything. That's not easy. That's really very difficult if you want to keep them in Germany and Europe. Then it's really 5 to 12. I need to do something about that. And not to forget one thing. We pay every year more than 1 million euros of EU contribution. 1 million, more than 1 million euros, which are actually taken from the profit, which will reduce the profit. And even there, you have a hard time actually offsetting it in the prices and explaining to the customers before coming to the customer's perspective. Mr. Reisinger, do we need some kind of politics that is more integrated, that doesn't have diverse things one next to the other without being related to one another? I think integrated is the right word. I think the request is that the climate protection policy in Germany is not a climate protection policy. It's just a kind of carpet consisting of various segments of various regimes, which are not conceived to be a smart system. I think that's going to change. But for the time being, it's like a rag jack. It can't work any longer like this. Of course, we have a lot of industrial customers with similar requirements, and they say 1 million euros of EU contribution. That's a tremendous amount of money. The question is, what could companies do in terms of investments with this amount of money? Maybe this would allow them to reduce their emissions even further. These are really issues because the money is missing elsewhere to use that. That would be the right model. I mean, investing. If you say, actually, I have an investment volume in this direction. If you take it in the car, no matter where, not by means of innovation, promotion, so in the tax area, that would be positive, wouldn't it? Mr. Schwab, what would you do with 1 million? I mean, climate. I would actually invest in climate protection funds. I think this is what's going to be done. Would invest in sustainability. Let's just use this word in saving energies, reducing CO2 emission, our competitiveness. Because one thing has to be seen clearly: no matter what we do, we need an efficient industry which is able to generate the money which we have to invest to this effect. Otherwise, things won't work out. There are lots of things we can think of, but for sure we're going to go into this direction. But apart from the million per year, over the last 5 years, we had a clear 6-digit amount. Nevertheless, we invested into energy efficiency and environment. And this tendency, just to answer the question in the end, this is a tendency we would actually consolidate, increase, invest in our general competitiveness, maintaining jobs, attractiveness, because that's also part of the sustainability, because if we don't actually find employees, because we're no longer attractive, that's it, you see. There are lots of fields in which we would invest. Now, for the outlook, let's leave a couple of things. Let me come back to sustainability. We said it's a bit more than just CO2. It's also about supply chains and transport ways. You have already talked about your process. The new process means that you will no longer have to send the goods out of externally, but so the transport ways would be done. So this buyer says, that's wonderful, so no transport ways. What is the reaction? How does your customer deal with this? Now the customer says, so what does it count? How much is that? How much can we save per piece? And then the customer pays what he can save with the additional amount he has to actually release things. He has to test it, he has to make the samples and so on. So on the customer side, this requires a certain effort, and the customer clearly says and just compares, what is my benefit? How much price does how much is the price reduced, and is it really worthwhile doing that? It's just a kind of calculation, a very cool calculation. But as I said before, we are sure, and this is also what drives us, that in addition to that, in fact, the sustainability is becoming more and more of an argument, but this is being generated right now gradually. It's just very, very, very slowly. It's like actually something which has it's like a germ bud, you see. We just have to pay attention not to destroy it. Especially now you said die casting actually invests a lot for car makers, and the requirements are being defined. And so in the end, all big buyers have already got their plans. So of course, in the pipeline, of course, we have to go towards certification and CO2 neutrality. Sourcing depends largely on the facts you can provide. Otherwise, you're out. That's the situation. Can we have a look at the future? You already planned that. Maybe also from your perspective, Mr. Reisinger, looking to the future, we will talk about politics in a minute, but let's stay with the economic system. What about the buyers? So will there be pressure from the customer side? Yes, I think so. And the entire chain, yeah. There are certain targets and they need to be realized. And in the past, well, 10 years will go by very quickly, and that's one thing we should not forget. After the financial crisis, we said that the next crisis will come. We don't know when. Now, actually, could not be anticipated, but there will be other things that may happen. We can't lean back and say, well, we have another 10 years' time. Let's just wait. So a mindset has been created, which requires just get away from the OEMs and this mindset will actually go through. On the other hand, we can only realize that, as Mr. Schwab said, if we have a win-win situation, then this is perfectly possible. Then the foundry can actually survive, and the OEM as well, and the customer as well. And this chain, we need to make sure how to move. Let me just start dreaming a bit. In theory, it is possible that the buyer who actually comes up with some pressure today may say, well, there's certain things we can't do any longer. Sourcing, for instance, should actually happen on a regional level because the transport ways are shorter. So I don't do something for my footprint only, but I'm evidently sustainable. I buy the potatoes not coming from Germany, but not from Spain, but from the other part of the Rhine. These are things you can do today, but will we see something like this in the automotive industry which is actually beneficial for you with regards to sourcing? I'm also talking about values or shifting values, the three of you. Actually, I'm firmly convinced this is something that will happen in every industry, and we can see that when looking at industries where it already happened. It's not just the die casting, but it's the printing industry that is actually much advanced because it started 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago, when the first printer said we are climate neutral or we are for climate neutral products. And then it took a long while until the first pioneers were copied, until this topic really arrived also among the buyers. In the meantime, we have a situation in which all renowned printers offer that and have already implemented their own programs. I would take this as an example of the food retailers. For many years, not a lot happened, but now looking at the two big discounters in Germany, they really want to join this topic a lot. So this actually has a cascade effect to the downstream supply chain. I do think that in the automotive industry this will happen as well. And the question only arises, will there be another criteria in terms of pressure which is built in order to meet the criteria? I think in the medium term it will, but in the long term, for companies, there will be some potential for differentiation. If you can already do it at this point, you will also be able to put that on the agenda for the manufacturers and stand out against them. Maybe in individual cases, this will also decide upon one order or the next one. So sustainability may be higher weight than price, for instance, might not be the only criterion. This is a situation which I experience in other industries as well. Until in 10 or 15 years, it will be a topic. If you're not able to supply that, you won't be actually able to participate in such a kind of tender. So if I get you correctly, you wouldn't actually exclude the fact that there may be a development in this direction which would be beneficial for you, or which would be beneficial for the region. You could say, so we can't do it at a cheaper price. We have lots of ambitions, but we will always be more expensive than lots of sites abroad. If this is not compensated or paid, then it may become difficult. What do you think? I think I agree with you. For 10 to 15 years, that's the development of the mindset we have. So there won't be any leaps, but what is possible to make sure we can invest today? So that's what you think. Bill Gates once said, you overestimate what is possible within 1 year, and you underestimate very often what is possible within 10 years. I think, and this will go into this direction, it started very gradually, all this topic, and it's going to increase in importance in the motor industry and other industries as well, in society. And I think if you actually tackle it correctly, if you see it as an opportunity as a company, that we can create this win-win situation Dr. Ioannidis was talking about, because without this, it wouldn't be possible. Because what would have to be the alternative? The environment should suffer from that, or industry should actually be destroyed. I mean, both of these things can't work out, can they? I think there must have to, there must be a way in the middle. Let's have a look at the political outlook. We just had our elections, so last round about CO2. Look into the future, you find the world works according to common standards. One and one is two. So China, USA, and Russia and EU agree. What about the CO2 balancing? Looking into the future, what would you say? About our situation 20 years? Will will we have parts of Chinese levels with a carbon footprint, or can we talk about an international harmonization? What's your outlook in this respect? I think so 50-50. I think the standards, like as the greenhouse gas protocol, are international. They're also used in China, basically. But I personally don't know so many companies, but frequently when medium-sized companies in Germany ask their suppliers in China about CO2 parameters, energy parameters, they can actually supply some figures. Not all of them, but they are increasing, of course. But there's one standard which actually works for all industries, can't exist because the industries are too diverse, I assume. There will be industry-specific substandards, or at least a kind of common practice, like in the die cast industry, to make a balance and what kind of factors need to be included just to allow for comparability. And although that's also a problem, and although actually you actually have the same factors in the balance, this does not by far not mean that you will have the same result, because there's certain emission factors which are the multipliers which you have with multiply with your energy comes with a cubic meter natural gas. It's quite simple because you can have a scientific calculation of the CO2. With steel, it's more difficult because it depends on how steel is made, where does it come from, how efficient is the supplier. So in case of doubt, you have an average value of a database. The next one, however, takes a different database and has a different average value. So that means although you may have the same input data twice, the likelihood would be high that the CO2 balance is not identical in the end. So in future, we will actually have to get more standardization specific for the industry or on a European level to add more clarity and transparency and to allow for a comparability of the balances. Thing of scope 3, the question is, do have a cradle to grave consideration? Where does the CO2 rucksack of the next issuer start? That's a difficult situation. Cradle to gate means from the cradle of the raw materials until the merchandise leaves the gate, and then there's an extension that it reaches the customer. And the cradle to grave means it's also the utilization and the disposal phase of the products made by me. So you're on the B2B business, so you don't make any final product, but a part which will actually be integrated into a car. How do you have to calculate the utilization phase? Or in cosmetic industry, if you make a bottle of shampoo, question is, what is the utilization phase? How often can I shower with it? How hard does it really have to be in my footprint just to take away the fear? My answer is, no, you don't have to enter that, because it really depends on the emissions you can control yourselves. If you make a vehicle which consumes 18 liters per 100 kilometer, you have a responsibility of what will happen in the utilization phase with it. But whether or not it's hot or cold, or what kind of shampoo you use for showering, you can only indirectly control it. So the balancing limits have to be set accordingly. But it shows that the range is rather wide for balancing. So as consultants, we can actually bring some light into the dark, and we can actually give a clear recommendation of what is common in the industry, and how to reach a valid and reliable CO2 balance. So there are lots of technical, we talked about a lot of background and looked into the future, but your entrepreneurial activity is taking place right now. So we had already discussed about a couple of things. The energy prices are really soaring, also the raw materials and CO2 certificates. Now more coal is actually, and there's not so much wind. So it's not the company's fault, but it's the condition under which you have to cope with. Now we're going to have a new government after the elections, which after the change of the year, they will start working. So we will start a new year. Now, let's say in the final round, I would like to ask you, what would be your most urgent wishes to politics in the system or in concrete regulations? Let's start with you. I think the country, Germany, needs to be more in the focus. Europe is wonderful. I'm a European, but we also have to take care of the country itself. There's one thing we must not forget. So the confession, we start and we do. So everything has to follow the premises. We need to define reasonable regulations which are sustainable. They shouldn't be shifted, and not even with smaller tidbits hidden in them, which need to be found out afterwards, to saying that, oh, it wasn't that rosy what you thought of, what you actually. But that's important. There's one thing they have to do in the governments. In Europe, we are strong, but we should not underestimate China, because the Chinese have the sun collectors, they took them and done. So accumulate is done, and that's it. So the green technology, once they start it, they will actually overhaul. They will actually overtake us. Micromanagement, and not. That sounds a bit like that. Yeah. I mean, the view of something like this needs to be a bit more focused. And if I focus this view and I understand what it's about, then I can actually try to adjust and define speed and use. I can say, what does my country need? But first I need to have a perspective and this view for something like this, and this is what the new government has to show, and quite quickly. Well, I agree with you. This morning we talked about that, or this afternoon, especially with regards to environment and energy. We need clear regulations, and not just a kind of rug tag that needs to absurdities that we are CO2 neutral, but still have to pay this money. I mean, something holistic and which is smart needs to be created, which actually offers entrepreneurial incentive and liberty and a clear framework, which can only be generated if the focus is correct and if the view is correct. And I really do hope, irrespective of which government is going to be, we should have it as quickly as possible, and they should actually agree as quickly as possible, no matter what kind of color combination we end up with. They should actually agree on a smart way, which has sustainability on the one hand, but also this. They should be compelled to deal in an economic way to cover industry as well, because one thing is important, because one thing is not possible without the other thing. We can't go back to the trees at the price of the climate neutrality, but we can actually try our globe at the cost of climate neutrality. Is that the right direction? Yes, I perfectly agree with the two gentlemen, Mr. Schwab, what you say. That's exactly the task here. We need to get away from this debate, economic growth or climate protection. For a long time, this was characterized in political discussions, and it was a conflict. And we could say, how much climate protection can economy afford? We need to get away from this. We need to understand that, well, climate protection costs money, but no climate protection costs even more money. This is the first important finding. And unfortunately, this year in Germany, we dramatically had to experience this, with the floodings and so on. If we don't do anything against that, this will be so expensive and will cost so many people's lives and will bring such a lot of suffering. We need to do something about that. But then we also have to understand that the money we invest in climate protection is money which needs to be invested in terms of investments, creating new possibilities, creates innovation. I've actually met lots of companies that deal with climate protection, sustainability, and they actually consider that to be a kind of suggestion to do something new and to reinvent themselves with new business models, new coding procedures. I don't know whether sustainability and energy saving was a driving force there, but frequently this question was the first step in the willingness to say we reconsider our business model, but certain basic pillars of our business activities we did not actually question in the past. We come up with completely new solution. That's a big opportunity we have. And there's one thing I would like to have from politics. Just to answer your question is the fact that the politics prepares the way, the tracks in a very smart way, that, let's say, economic space and liberty. They shouldn't actually do everything just by means of target and bans, but they should also create the free space to actually implement all these topics, because I think there's a willingness. But if people are really insecure of how to do that, how to work it out, and when is required what, so they need to clarify everything. So especially the SMEs should not be left alone in all that. Thank you, Röge. Thank you very much for your three statements. Very clear. These were actually final statements, but I think there are a couple of minutes left. We may have a short discussion. Question to the auditorium. Questions from you, Ms. Virius. Did we get any input, digital input? Presently, we don't have any questions, but here I would simply have a look at people sitting here. Do you have any questions? The topic is so complex, we just feel beaten up. I think this is what the discussion showed. It's really a wide range we're talking about. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. One question to Mr. Schwab. You could be the encouraging person of the day. You work with your company. Dr. You knew this as well. You've been working for more than 10 years under a green government. What does it feel like? I mean, does it work out? Obviously it does. The intrinsic motivation was there. Was there any kind of pressure from any part, or let's say these encouragers? Do they exist? And what Dr. Reisinger mentioned, the companies must not be left alone. Do you feel that here in this area? I'll be interested in learning that just with regards to the constellation of whatever color we may have in the next year. So, Mr. President, since he started up to the present day, he has actually gathered some experience with regards to the company, in what economy means in Baden-Württemberg, what it requires, and together with the coalition partner, actually started the ways accordingly. So, in Baden-Württemberg, there's a finding, meaning what a green government may look like. It doesn't have to be hostile to economy, but the question is just, can it learn? And is it willing to learn? And that's the difference. That makes the difference. While the regional government in the last few years have really been willing and able to learn. So the question arises, will they be able to learn and willing to learn on federal level as well? Yes, I agree with that. I can remember that when we had the regional elections and we had a green and red regional government. We said, oh, that's the end of the old days. And just because of a bit of a station. But this is not what happened, you see. No matter what color such a government has, if it's not deep red or deep brown, there are not certain things it can actually circumvent, as Dr. Januta said. If the government can learn if it has actually knowledge and a clear mind and focus. And when it comes to making courage, if you do that from yourself, from in an intrinsic way, I mean, you don't need the drive from outside. I mean, I think one question is okay. I think that was the regional level. Now let's, of course, see that on a European level. We have examples showing that good ideas can be implemented from Germany, but not necessarily lots of followers are found in Germany. We know these topics, and we hope that this won't happen. So I would like to ask Dr. Reisinger, do you have some good, motivating concepts you may actually share with the Europeans? Well, it's a difficult topic. I mean, a couple of years ago, Germany was still in The Economist with the energy change as the exemplary student, worldwide #1. But there's not so much left of this picture because, to be honest, I think 7 out of 10 of the biggest coal power stations are in Germany. If we look at it in a very neutral way, we're not in a position that we can lean back. I mean, we really have to do a lot and live into the future. I think it's always just beginning to get by getting a realistic idea of yourself. We are good at in a lot of areas, but we are not good everywhere. We can also learn from our European neighbors or other neighbors and see that they have done things better. But it's not always that easy for us to do. And of course, every politics has to be controlled on a European level if you really want to move something. And looking at how the different ways in which this is handled is also some countries it's photovoltaics, others it's wind energy. In the third country, nothing happens at all. This should not be the case. So I wonder if we are talking so much about. The question was, where does the energy of the future come from? If I go through the countries, in our country or other countries, I wouldn't say that I see lots of photovoltaic over there. I wouldn't say that every house roof is equipped with photovoltaic modules. But I think all the topics which are very close are not being fully utilized. So we should have other things such as a Green Deal, which should become visible. And we should be in a situation that each and every company should actually have a photovoltaic system on the roof if it's not in the north position in the shadow. I mean, that's not where the level we've reached. It's really a complicated situation. I want to have more clarity and more European standardization. I would like to thank the three of you, Mr. Ioannidis, Mr. Schwab, Dr. Reisinger, for this very lively and vivid discussion. I would just leave it like this. Just with the appeal to the future, we can really anticipate such a lot of new things for the future. We'd like to give back, so I would come back to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for this very informative day, press day. I would also like to thank the participants behind the screens. And just for your information, this discussion was recorded as well, and afterwards, presumably within the next week, you can find it in the newsroom of the EUROGUSS website in German and in English. And for all those who are here, I can just say, I wish you a good way back home. So come back home in a healthy way, and we're looking forward to seeing you again at the EUROGUSS 2021. Thanks a lot.